So I think it's complicated, that question. Do you think most Trump supporters are racist deep down? I just don't see how you couldn't be if you support this guy. So here's the thing that I would like to differentiate around this discussion is I think all racists are Trump supporters, but not all Trump supporters are racist. But I would like to delineate, though, the idea of grappling with racism versus being a racist. Now, the term being a racist, for me, I tend to apply that term to people who openly use the dog whistles and they use the racist tropes. And they actually, whether they're wearing the hoods or not, they're actually behaving in a way where they are specifically putting forward racist dog whistles. People who talk about black on black crime in Chicago, call people welfare queens, people like Trump, even people like Candace Owens and Ben Shapiro and Matt Walsh, all these right-wing influencers, they are outwardly using racist tropes and generalizations. And so I think those people are racist, even though they would not admit it. But now, what I think some of the Trump supporters are, is they are people that have struggles with racism that maybe they aren't even aware of. And we all have struggles with racism. I mean, anytime you find yourself believing a racial stereotype, or it could be as simple as if you live in a white neighborhood and you see a black guy walking down the street, you may do a double take and watch him differently going up the street because you don't see a lot of black guys in your neighborhood. Now, when you do that, you are grappling with racism. That doesn't mean you're a racist. We all encounter shit like that. But that doesn't mean you are a racist. Like, non-racist people grapple with racism and the effects of racism all the time. When we buy into stereotypes or prejudices, or we find ourselves, using different standards. Like, for example, if somebody who might hear that Kamala Harris is low IQ, and then they decide to believe that and not investigate that. That is sort of grappling with racism, because obviously a woman with a law degree who, was the attorney general of the biggest state in America is not low IQ. You know what I'm saying? Or believing that all immigrants are dangerous. That's racism. And a lot of times I think it is subconscious. Where I've said this before, like me growing up in a small town in Wisconsin, there might be a person of color or two in these towns, and there will be a bunch of people who will be nice to that person of color. And then they believe because they're nice to that person of color, they're not grappling with any racism because they're nice to the person of color. But they might also look at Obama and say, I don't know what it is about him. I just don't like him. That type of thing, I think, is a subconscious, distrust. Like, I used to see it in my family. Like, my mom was not racist at all. And yet, if she was walking down the street and there was a young black man walking toward her, she would be nervous and be worried about his presence. And that was the type of racism that she grappled with, that was passed along to her from small town Wisconsin upbringing. Just a general idea about black men being dangerous. But my mom wasn't a racist, but she definitely grappled with racism in those kinds of subconscious sort of bias carrying ways. And many, many, many Trump supporters grapple with those types of things. I mean, you can see it in the fact that they don't want to admit that there are systemic racism issues in America. But we know there are, right? We know there's Oprah Winfrey and LeBron James, you know what I'm saying? But there's a ginormous wealth gap between the average black family and the average white family. And why is that? That is because of the hundreds of years of slavery and Jim Crow and segregation and redlining and all that prevented generations of black people from acquiring generational wealth that got handed down. And that's a systemic type of racism here that has prevented a majority of black families from having any generational wealth that they've inherited. That is systemic racism that exists here. And it's not gone. It won't be gone until there's more parity there with the generational wealth. But a vast swath of Trump supporting people want to believe or need to believe that it's not like that. They believe that there's racism because the Democrats are talking about race. But obviously, like, talking about race is not going to create racism. You can't create shit simply by talking about it. It's not how it works. Like, for example, in our household here, we have a step family. So all this sort of racism and shit like that, it's all power dynamics. That's really what it is. And there's power dynamics everywhere. But for example, in my family, me and Jenny and Bryce, there are power dynamics in our step family that get very complicated. Sometimes Jenny feels like Bryce has more power in the household than she does because he's my blood. And he and I have a bond that is never going to end. Whereas she and I have a bond that our relationship could end, and it's different, right? And sometimes Bryce, sometimes he feels like he has more power. He feels that power dynamic. And other times he feels like nobody wants him here. Okay, those are very complicated dynamics that exist in our step family. And the thing about it is we talk about them all the time. Like at least once a week, we have some type of heart-to-heart talk about those power dynamics. We have to. That's how we continually work on them and keep advancing our personal relationships and managing it. Those talks don't create the dynamic. Those talks are how we solve it, how we let everybody know that we're aware of the issues and we can talk about them when they come up, and we're working with each other to find solutions and to find ways of overcoming those awkward power dynamics that the step family has generated. We have the same shit here with racism and sexism and things like that in America. People losing rights or people not having rights. But when you deny that those issues exist and you're not willing to have the conversations, that's like grappling with a type of denial that I don't think necessarily makes the Trump supporters all racist, but there is a type of racism that I think they grapple with, a lot of his supporters, that they're not even aware of. And at its most basic level, it's this idea that they don't want to accept the racist underpinnings of our country. I mean, it's really hard. Patriotism in America is hard because you can revere the founding fathers and you can revere the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and all that, but you simultaneously have to know that the guys who wrote that shit were savages. They were horrible fucking people who enslaved an entire race of people and exploited them for 100 years and got wealthy and powerful and cared not for them at all. And they used their religion to justify those actions. So they were like, did really great things with our Constitution and the founding of this country, but they were horrible, savage, terrible human beings at the same time. And so, you know, rectifying that like, wow, right? Rectifying those two things is really hard. I mean, I have it in my own life. You might have this too. My father was a guy who went to prison. He was very abusive. He was abusive to my mother. He was abusive to me. He was abusive to my sisters and my half brothers. He was very toxic. And simultaneously, there were parts of my dad who was a great fucking man. And I got really great things from him. And I loved him very much. And he had a heart of gold while simultaneously being an abuser. Being able to rectify those things and have a realistic look. Like, I can't be a better man and be a better man to my lady and my son and have those discussions about the step family power dynamics if I can't look honestly at the good and bad of my own upbringing? And that's one of the things about the Make America Great Again, even in their slogan. They think somehow it was great before and we need to go back there, but that's never the case. It's always getting better down the road because the more knowledgeable you are, the more compassionate you are, the more you evolve, you get better as a human being in the future. There's never a time where, oh, I was better back then and now I'm fucking terrible. No. So that is complicated with the Trumpian sort of mindset. Like some Trump voters would argue that transgender rights have created some huge problem. And they're talking about men in sports, which doesn't exist. Or they're talking about teachers transing kids, which isn't happening. They're talking about all this crazy shit, but the reality is transgender people have existed forever. They've been fighting for rights and representation forever. And what's happening now is they're starting to gain power. And the people who are opposed to them gaining power are now thinking that them having rights is the problem. But I think one of the Trumpian issues that goes beyond whether it's around the racism stuff or the anti-LGBTQ stuff, I believe in general, they have some views about power where they believe if the people around them gain power, that means they're going to lose power. They see it as a zero-sum game. If the trans people gain power, they're afraid they're going to lose power. If the black people gain power, they're afraid they're going to lose power. If the immigrants gain power, they think they're going to lose power. And when you come from a place of healing and you come from a place of acknowledging the reality of the situations, you realize that everybody can be empowered. You don't have to lose power in order to empower other people. Sometimes what you want to do is you want to give the power. It's not about losing it. It's about offering it up. But that's a thing, though, that Trump voters just in general grapple with. They do. It's something they deeply grapple with. But again, I know that was a long, crazy tangent, but I think it's an important one because I don't think all Trump supporters are racist. But I think that most all Trump supporters, if they're not aware, there's no way you can be a Trump supporter and not be grappling with racism because Trump uses racist dog whistles and he is a racist individual in so many ways. So if you're supporting him, you are supporting a racist. And if you're not a racist, but you're supporting a racism, you are definitely grappling with some type of racism. You know, you can't support a racist and not be grappling with racism, even if it's grappling with, objectively saying you're okay with racism. If they get accused of it unfairly, they need to realize there are consequences of supporting him. I mean, yeah, that's true. Like supporting a racist is going to get you, if you go to work and you take a friend into work who's wearing a KKK outfit, the people there are going to assume you might be KKK friendly. We are assumed guilt by association. But I think it's beyond that. Like for me, I wish we could come to grips with the fact that we should be able to talk about the racism separating the idea of being a racist. Like we all grapple with racism and with sexism and with various religious phobias. It's just mostly when we encounter bias that we lean on, bias that we all encounter. You encounter it in jokes, in media portrayals. People from my generation, especially, we grew up where people on TV were very stereotypical. They had characters on TV when I was a kid. Archie Bunker was the stereotypical racist. And he had a daughter who dated a hippie, the meathead, who was a stereotypical lazy hippie. right, arguing against the Vietnam War. And they had a black guy who lived down the street, Mr. Jefferson, who had a business, who was the well-spoken black guy, right? The Obama. Like those stereotypes. Or they had a show called Good Times, which was about a black family that lived in the projects. And every one of those characters were stereotypes. Every TV character, even the women were like the trophy blonde who was like, you know, really pretty, but she was so dumb, everyone had to like help her out. It was like we were ingrained with this is the 5 different types of people. And then you go out in the world and you try to stuff everybody into those boxes. And, you know, that is evolving now. All of those stereotypes are evolving and being sort of torn apart in a way. And I think it's really hard because I think some people liked it better when the world was more in boxes like that. I think for some people, it's just, they found it a little easier to process. But MAGA, though, the thing about MAGA is a lot of MAGA is a class issue. That's not saying there are plenty of racists in MAGA, and there's a lot of racism and bias in MAGA. But I think the class issue is the biggest part of MAGA, because that's why they're distrustful of education. That is why they resent, you know, the immigrants and the women rising into power and shit because of these class struggles. Because despite the privilege you have in being in America of being white, there is a lot of white privilege in America. But when you are lower class white and you are struggling and you don't have a lot of education, and then you see black people like going to Harvard and getting the good job, that is very complicated for the white privilege to process. People of color going out there and getting opportunities because they've elevated to a different class. Like, we have a real issue in America with class struggles, and it's gotten really bad. It's a huge issue. And it infects everything. For example, I was looking up Christian Slater, who's my age, right? And I was like, God damn, when he was like 20 years old, he was acting in Pump Up the Volume. When I was 20 years old, I was like barely struggling to hold a job, right? So I did a little investigation into Christian Slater to see what his upbringing was like. And I discovered that he grew up on the Upper East Side of New York, and he went to a private school that cost $60,000 a year. And again, that's not the only reason Christian Slater became successful at age 20, but it is a huge part of the reason. Every kid that goes to a $60,000 a year school, that is born into a family that has all the money and the nannies, and they can go to LA and live for a year and just devote themselves to acting and take all the acting classes, and they're never going to have to worry because they're taken care of. Those people have all the advantages. In the capitalist system, those who have the advantages are usually going to be the ones that succeed 9 times out of 10. And it's gotten really, really pronounced, almost to the fact that if you look at every new person who blows up and becomes really successful as an influencer, or really successful as an actor, or really successful as a musician, 90% of the time, they are people coming from wealthy families. And it's not because the people from the wealthy families are doing the parenting better or they're making better kids. It's simply stated they have enough money for help. They have all the help. They have the help. It's like the same reason why whoever has the most money usually wins the election. The candidate who makes the most money will often win the election. Doesn't matter if they're a good candidate or bad candidate. If they're a really, really horrible candidate, they can lose. But if you take 2 equally good candidates, the one with the most money is going to win that election, almost always. And this is the problem we're confronting in America, is because of years of financial institutions like trickle-down economics of Reagan and years of tax cuts for wealthy people and removal of regulations that allow companies to become vertical monopolies and horizontal monopolies. And you go to the grocery store and there's only 10 companies that own everything. Because of years of letting that get out of hand, the class struggles now are like massive. We have a massive class struggle, but it's not just economic class, right? Who else votes for Trump? A lot of guys, a lot of white guys. That's a class struggle. There's a gender class. I mean, you see it in the way the male candidate gets treated differently than the female candidate. She's expected to be more precise, more perfect. She can't make mistakes. She gets harsher judged. She gets told that she's weak automatically. She has to prove she's strong. So you have gender classes, you have financial classes, there are racial classes, but the MAGA, though, the biggest base of MAGA is white men. White men that lack education is sort of a huge portion of the MAGA base. That class of person, they are still privileged, but they are not as privileged as they were 30 years ago, 40 years ago. 40 years ago, an uneducated white man could still continually fail upward in most instances, no matter what social class he was in. An uneducated white man could kind of continually fail upward. And it's a little harder now. Uneducated white men struggle a lot more now than they did 40 years ago. And I think that's a big problem. Some of the MAGA set they're struggling while it appears to them that a whole bunch of the rest of the world isn't struggling. And their privilege is not overriding their struggle. And so it's gotten a lot more challenging. It used to be you would go into the boardroom and all of those guys would be the white dudes. And now it's a little different. Now there's women of color, there's trans people, there's gay people. And it's really interesting, too, because that is a big part of Donald Trump's shtick, is being the guy who's fighting for that class warfare. Even though he's not fighting for that class warfare at all. He never has been.